The screaming started before dawn, as it always did on Catachan 7. Marcus Thorne pressed his scarred face against the moisture-slick walls of his family's shelter, listening to the sounds of death filtering through the perpetual green twilight of the jungle canopy. Something large was feeding in the settlement's outer perimeter, the wet, tearing noises mixed with human cries that cut off abruptly one by one, until only the constant drip of condensation and the rustle of predatory plants marked the transition from night to day. This was life on a death world. This was normal. Marcus had been born into this hell 23 standard years ago, delivered in the same reinforced bunker where his family now huddled while unknown horrors stalked the killing grounds beyond their walls. His first breath had been the recycled air of a world trying to murder him. His first sight had been the pulsing bioluminescence of carnivorous fungi that grew in the corners where metal met flesh. His first sound had been his mother's whispered prayers to the Emperor, begging for just one more day of survival in a place where survival was measured in hours. The death world of Catachan 7 existed in a state of permanent biological warfare. Every living thing on its surface had evolved for one purpose: to kill everything else with maximum efficiency and minimum warning. The trees bled acid that could dissolve ceramide armor. The flowers released spores that turned human lungs into breeding grounds for parasitic wasps. The very air carried microscopic predators that would eat a man from the inside out, leaving only a walking skeleton that continued to move for days before finally collapsing into dust. Yet somehow, impossibly, humans lived here. They survived by becoming something harder than the world that spawned them, something meaner than the creatures that hunted them, something more ruthless than the plants that tried to digest them while they still drew breath. They became Catachan devils, and the Imperium counted them among its most fearsome warriors. But before they could fight for the Emperor across the galaxy, they had to survive childhood on a world that killed 90% of its inhabitants before their 15th birthday. Marcus crept away from the wall as the feeding sounds finally faded into the distance. His father, Sergeant Major Bram Thorne of the Catachan 2 Jungle Fighters, was already awake and checking their perimeter sensors. The old soldier's body bore the ritual scars that marked him as a true son of Catachan. Parallel lines across his shoulders from barking toad claws, a spiral pattern on his chest from devil's claw thorns, and the distinctive cross-hatched marks on his forearms that showed he had survived a death spitter attack. "Man-eater shark," Bram said without looking up from his sensor display. "Big one, maybe 8 meters. Took the Henley family during the night. Found pieces of their shelter scattered across half a kilometer of jungle floor." Marcus absorbed this information without emotion. Emotional responses to death were a luxury that Catachan couldn't afford. The Henley family had consisted of 7 people, 2 adults, 3 teenagers, and 2 children under 10. They had lived in the settlement for 6 years, had survived Devilthorn season and 2 separate brainleaf infestations, had even managed to fight off a pack of amble during the dry season 3 years back. But none of that mattered when a man-eater shark decided your home looked like food. Their youngest boy was about your age when you started the trials. Bram continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that all Catachan natives developed when discussing violent death. Showed promise with a laser gun, might have made it off-world with the next recruitment cycle. The trials. Marcus felt his stomach tighten at the mention of Catachan's coming-of-age ritual. In 3 months, when he turned 24 standard years, he would be required to venture into the deep jungle alone, armed with nothing but a combat knife in his bare hands, to retrieve a Catachan fang from the mouth of a living, barking toad. Those who returned alive could call themselves true Catachan devils. Those who didn't return became cautionary tales for the next generation. The survival rate for the trials was roughly 30%. Better odds than simple childhood on Catachan, but not by much. "You ready for breakfast?" his mother Elena asked from the cooking area. Her own scars told the story of 25 years on Catachan. a twisted pattern across her left shoulder where spiker spines had punched through muscle to scrape bone, acid burn marks on her hands from harvesting devil's claw sap, and a long, puckered line down her right thigh where a catachan barb had laid its eggs before she managed to cut them out with a heated knife blade. She was considered beautiful by catachan standards, which meant she had retained most of her original limbs and could still bear children who survived longer than 6 months. The breakfast consisted of roasted grox meat, fried spiker eggs, and devil's claw fruit that had been carefully processed to remove the naturally occurring toxins that caused paralysis and respiratory failure. The water came from their recycling system, filtered through activated charcoal and purification tablets that left it tasting of metal and industrial chemicals. It was a feast by Death World standards, rich in proteins and nutrients that would help build the muscle density and reflexes necessary for survival. Marcus ate mechanically, his mind focused on the sounds filtering in from the jungle beyond their walls. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of twigs, each distant roar or screech carried information that could mean the difference between life and death. His augmented hearing, enhanced by years of exposure to Catachan's acoustic environment, sorted through the auditory data with practiced efficiency. Brainleaf colony 300 meters to the northwest, recently fed low threat level. A pack of razor wings circling at canopy level hunting for carrion. Something large moving through the underbrush 800 meters south, probably a catachan elephant looking for a watering hole. And underneath it all, the constant background hum of smaller predators. Death crawlers, spiker colonies, acid flies, and 1,000 other species that existed solely to turn living creatures into dead ones. This was the symphony of Catachan 7, and every native learned to read its patterns or died trying. After breakfast, Marcus joined his father for the daily ritual of perimeter maintenance. Their settlement, New Esperanza, consisted of 47 structures housing roughly 300 souls. It was considered a major population center by Catachan standards, large enough to support its own PDF garrison and primitive manufactorum complex. The settlement had existed for 12 years, making it practically ancient by Death World standards. Most Catachan settlements lasted 18 months before being consumed by the jungle. The perimeter defense grid consisted of multiple layers of deterrence and destruction. The outer ring featured motion-activated flamers designed to incinerate fast-moving threats, plasma mines that could take down armored predators, and sonic disruptors that interfered with the echolocation systems used by many of Catachan's nocturnal hunters. The middle ring contained automated turrets loaded with explosive shells, electrified barriers that could deliver lethal shocks to anything that touched them, and proximity sensors that tracked movement patterns for the settlement's tactical computers. The inner ring was where things got serious. Here, the defenses were designed not just to kill attackers, but to make sure their deaths served as warnings to other potential threats. Molecular acid dispensers that could reduce a man-eater shark to its component atoms in seconds. Gravitational field generators that could crush a Catachan elephant into a sphere of compressed flesh and bone. Neural disruptors that turned living creatures' own nervous systems against them, causing seizures so violent that they literally tore themselves apart. Even with all these defenses, New Esperanza lost an average of 2 families per month to jungle predators. "Remember," Bram said as they inspected a section of electrified fencing, "the moment you start thinking you're safe on Catachan is the moment the jungle kills you. These defenses aren't here to keep us safe. They're here to buy us time to die with weapons in our hands instead of being digested while we sleep." Marcus nodded, running his hands along the fence line to check for signs of acid damage or predator testing. The metal showed numerous scratches and burn marks where various creatures had investigated the barriers, probing for weaknesses with claws, teeth, chemical secretions, and stranger sensory organs. Some of the marks were fresh, made during the previous night while the family slept. Something had been very close to their home, separated from his sleeping form by nothing but a few meters of space and some electrified metal. The inspection revealed 3 significant problems. A brain leaf tendril had grown under the southern fence section during the night, its psychic emanations already beginning to interfere with the motion sensor grid. A pack of death crawlers had been testing the eastern barriers, their acid saliva slowly eating through the protective coating on the support posts. Most seriously, something large had been pushing against the northern perimeter with enough force to bend the reinforced supports. Catachan Devil, Bram identified after examining the damage. Full-grown adult, maybe 2.5 meters at the shoulder, probably following scent trails from the Henley family kill. Looking for easy pickings. Catachan Devils were the apex predators of their world, creatures so perfectly adapted for killing that they had given their name to the human survivors who shared their environment. They stood 3 meters tall at the shoulder, weighed as much as a small aircraft, and possessed reflexes that could track and intercept last bolt fire. Their hide was thick enough to stop small arms fire, their claws could shred ceramite armor, and their intelligence rivaled that of unaugmented humans. A single Catachan Devil could eliminate a small settlement in under an hour if it decided the effort was worthwhile. We'll need to reinforce this section before nightfall, Bram decided, and set up additional sensor coverage to track its movement patterns. If it decides we're too much trouble, it'll move on to easier prey. If it decides we're worth the effort, he didn't need to finish the sentence. If the devil decided to press its attack, New Esperanza would join the long list of failed settlements that had once tried to tame Catachan 7th. The morning's work proceeded with the methodical efficiency that marked all Catachan survival techniques. Every action was calculated to maximize effectiveness while minimizing exposure to the countless threats that surrounded them. Every tool was cleaned and checked after use. Every material was examined for signs of contamination or decay. Every decision was evaluated against the fundamental question that governed life on a death world. Will this help me survive another day? By midday, the reinforced barriers were in place and the sensor grid had been expanded to provide early warning of devil movement. Marcus had learned to operate 3 different types of automated weapon system, identified 4 new species of potentially lethal plant life that had sprouted overnight, and memorized the attack patterns of barking toads so he would recognize the signs if one established territory near their settlement. It was considered a light morning by Catachan standards. Lunch was interrupted by the settlement's emergency alarm, a harsh klaxon that sent every resident scrambling for their assigned battle positions. Marcus grabbed his lasgun and followed his father to the northeastern watchpost, where Corporal Hask was tracking something through his scope. "Multiple contacts," Hask reported without taking his eye from the site. Human signatures moving in formation through the deep jungle. Distance approximately 2 kilometers and closing. Estimated arrival time 40 minutes. Human contacts were almost more dangerous than predatory wildlife. Catachan produced 2 types of people: those who served the Imperium as soldiers and those who served themselves as raiders, pirates, or worse. The settlement's tactical computer was already running probability assessments based on movement patterns and approach vectors. "Imperial Guard?" Elena asked as she joined them at the watchpost, her own weapon ready for immediate use. "No Imperial beacon signatures," Hask replied. "No Vox contact on standard Imperial frequencies. Movement pattern suggests combat experience but not formal military training." Raiders then, or possibly deserters from one of the Imperial Guard regiments. Both were common on Catachan, where the distinction between soldier and bandit was often a matter of current employment rather than fundamental character. The settlement's defenses were activated to full combat readiness. Automated weapon systems targeted the approaching contacts. Civilians moved to hardened shelters. The PDF garrison prepared to repel boarding actions. Within 10 minutes, New Esperanza had transformed from a peaceful farming community into a fortress ready to fight for its survival. The approaching humans announced themselves with last fire. The first shot struck the outer perimeter sensors, systematically disabling the settlement's early warning network with precision that spoke of professional military training. The attackers had studied New Esperanza's defenses, mapped its sensor coverage, and planned their assault to neutralize its advantages. Marcus found himself assigned to Fire Team Beta, responsible for defending the southeastern approach. His position was a reinforced fighting pit that offered excellent fields of fire across the killing ground between the settlement and the jungle. His laser gun was loaded with high-energy power cells that could punch through most personal armor. His backup weapons included fragmentation grenades, a melt-a-charge for anti-armor work, and his father's old combat knife for close-quarters fighting. Everything was ready. Now they waited for the enemy to come within range. The attack began with a diversionary assault on the settlement's main gate. 20 raiders armed with autoguns and improvised explosives launched a frontal attack that drew the attention of most of the PDF garrison. Their assault was loud, dramatic, and completely ineffective against New Esperanza's prepared defenses. It was also intended to mask the real attack. While the PDF concentrated on the main assault, smaller groups of raiders infiltrated the settlement's perimeter from 3 different directions. These were the professionals, the killers who understood Katashan warfare. They moved with the silence of native hunters, used the jungle's natural cover to approach within striking distance, and carried weapons designed for maximum lethality in close combat. Marcus's fire team engaged the southeastern infiltration group at a range of 50 meters. His first shot took down a raider carrying a flamer, the explosive detonation of the weapon's fuel tank creating a brief fireball that illuminated the jungle canopy. His second shot missed as the enemy dove for cover behind a fallen log that provided concealment from the settlement's firing positions. The battle devolved into a vicious close-quarters fight that tested every skill Marcus had learned during his years on Katachan. The raiders were experienced fighters who understood jungle warfare, but they lacked the lifetime of survival training that marked true Katachan natives. They made small mistakes, moving too quickly through areas where silence was essential, failing to account for the acoustic properties of different types of vegetation, underestimating the lethality of the settlement's defensive measures. Each mistake cost lives. Marcus killed 3 raiders during the first phase of the engagement, his shots placed with the precision that came from years of hunting game whose reflexes were faster than human thought. His fire team eliminated 7 more, their coordinated fire patterns creating overlapping kill zones that left the attackers with no safe avenues of movement. But the raiders had advantages of their own. They were mobile while the defenders were tied to fixed positions. They could choose when and where to engage, and, most importantly, they were willing to accept casualties that would be unthinkable in conventional warfare. The southeastern infiltration group was eliminated, but at a cost. Fire Team Beta lost 2 members to raider fire, including Corporal Hask, whose expertise with the settlement's sensor systems had made their defense possible. The surviving defenders had expended most of their ammunition and taken wounds that would require medical attention. Similar battles were being fought at every point around the settlement's perimeter. The raiders' plan was sound: overwhelm the defenders with multiple simultaneous attacks, force them to exhaust their resources, then exploit the gaps created by casualties and equipment failures. Against a conventional target, the strategy might have succeeded, but New Esperanza was not a conventional target. It was a Katachan settlement, home to people who had spent their entire lives fighting for survival against odds that would crush normal human populations. The settlement's final line of defense was not its weapons or fortifications, but its people. 300 souls who had learned that survival meant taking risks that rational analysis would call suicidal, who understood that sometimes the only way to live through a situation was to embrace the certainty of death. When the raiders breached the outer perimeter, they found themselves facing enemies who fought with the desperate fury of cornered predators, Catachan natives who used the jungle's own lethality as a weapon, who turned every tree and bush into a potential ambush site, who transformed the settlement's familiar terrain into a killing ground where experience mattered more than numbers or equipment. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, 47 raiders lay dead among the prefabricated structures and defensive barriers of New Esperanza. The settlement had lost 23 defenders, including several families that had been completely eliminated when their shelters took direct hits from explosive weapons. It was considered a minor victory by Catachan standards. The aftermath of the raid brought a different kind of challenge. Bodies had to be disposed of before they attracted scavengers. Damaged equipment had to be repaired or replaced. Wounded defenders required medical treatment that stretched the settlement's limited resources. Most importantly, the defensive perimeter had to be restored to full effectiveness before nightfall brought the jungle's nocturnal predators. Marcus spent the evening hours helping to clear debris from the battle zone, sorting through the scattered remains of equipment and structures for anything that could be salvaged. The work was necessary but depressing, a reminder of how easily their small community could be swept away by forces beyond their control. Among the raider bodies, he found equipment that told disturbing stories. Imperial Guard issue weapons that had been modified with non-regulation accessories. Communication devices keyed to frequencies used by off-world criminal organizations. Most ominously, several of the dead raiders carried identity tags from disbanded Penal Legion units. The implications were clear. These were not simply local bandits or desperate survivors turned to crime. They were off-world criminals who had been sent to Catachan as punishment, had survived their sentences and were now preying on the legitimate settlements that struggled to maintain imperial law on the Death World. "We'll need to report this to the PDF command," Bram decided after examining the evidence. "If there are organized criminal elements operating in this sector, every settlement needs to be warned." But the nearest PDF garrison was 3 days' march through hostile jungle, and communication equipment powerful enough to reach them had been damaged during the battle. Someone would have to make the journey on foot, carrying the information that might save other communities from similar attacks. Someone expendable enough that their loss wouldn't cripple New Esperanza's defenses, but skilled enough to survive 3 days alone in the Catachan jungle. Someone like Marcus, who would be undertaking the survival trials in 3 months anyway. "I'll go," he volunteered, though the words felt like signing his own death sentence. "I know the route to Firebase Alpha 7. If I leave before dawn, I can be there by midday tomorrow." The decision was made with the same matter-of-fact acceptance that marked all Catachan choices between different forms of potential death. Marcus would attempt the journey because someone had to, and he was the most logical choice given the settlement's limited resources and personnel. If he succeeded, other settlements might be warned in time to prepare their defenses. If he failed, his death would at least preserve New Esperanza's remaining defenders for future threats. Either outcome served the greater good of Imperial survival on Catachan 7th. Marcus spent the night preparing for his solo journey into the deep jungle. His equipment was stripped down to absolute essentials: a combat knife, a compact laser gun with 3 power cells, basic medical supplies, water purification tablets, and emergency rations for 2 days. Everything else was weight that would slow him down without providing corresponding benefits. His clothing was the lightweight combat fatigues that all Catachan natives wore, tough enough to resist casual damage from thorns and claws, but thin enough to allow rapid movement and heat dissipation. His boots were the flexible, silent footwear that let a man move through jungle terrain without advertising his presence to every predator within kilometer. Most importantly, his mind was prepared for the psychological challenge of traveling alone, through an environment where every shadow might conceal death, where every sound could herald attack, where survival depended on maintaining perfect alertness for hours at a time without rest or relaxation. He left New Esperanza 2 hours before dawn, while the nocturnal predators were seeking shelter, and the diurnal hunters had not yet begun their morning patrol cycles. This was the closest thing to a safe time that existed on Catachan 7, a narrow window when the jungle's lethality was at its minimum. Even at minimum, the death rate for solo travelers was approximately 80%. The route to Firebase Alpha 7 led through some of the most dangerous terrain on Catachan 7. Marcus would have to cross 3 separate brainleaf colonies, navigate around a known man-eater shark feeding ground, and traverse the Whispering Hills where sonic-based predators used acoustic camouflage to lure prey into killing range. Each obstacle required different survival techniques, different threat assessment protocols, different split-second decision-making processes. A single mistake would mean death. Multiple mistakes were guaranteed. The first hour of travel went smoothly, taking Marcus through familiar terrain that he had hunted and patrolled since childhood. Here he knew every tree, every rock, every potential hiding place that might conceal threats. His movement was swift and silent, covering ground at a pace that would be impossible for off-world humans unused to Catachan's unique challenges. But familiar terrain was also the most dangerous because familiarity bred overconfidence, and overconfidence killed more Catachan natives than all the planet's predators combined. Marcus forced himself to maintain full alertness as he moved through areas he had traversed hundreds of times before. Every footstep was placed with careful consideration of noise levels and surface stability. Every breathing cycle was controlled to minimize sound production and scent dispersal. Every glance around his environment was systematic, searching for anomalies that might indicate predator presence or territorial changes. The discipline kept him alive as he encountered his first major threat of the journey. The Brainleaf colony had expanded since his last patrol through this area, its psychic tendrils now covering a much wider area than his mental maps indicated. The colony's influence manifested as a subtle disorientation, a feeling that his thoughts were becoming fuzzy and unfocused. His survival training recognized the symptoms immediately, but recognizing the threat and avoiding it were two different challenges. Brainleaf colonies attacked through direct mental manipulation using psychic emanations to confuse prey animals and lure them within range of the colony's digestive enzymes. The plants could induce hallucinations, false memories, and irresistible compulsions to approach seemingly safe areas that were actually feeding zones lined with acid-secreting tendrils. The standard Imperial response to brainleaf infestation was orbital bombardment followed by chemical sterilization of the affected area. But Marcus was alone, armed only with personal weapons, and facing a colony that had already begun affecting his mental processes. He had two choices: attempt to navigate around the expanded colony, adding hours to his travel time and increasing his exposure to other threats, or push through the affected area using mental discipline techniques to resist the psychic influence. Both options carried significant risks. The detour would require him to travel through territory he had not previously scouted, where unknown predators might be waiting in ambush. But attempting to cross the Brainleaf colony meant accepting direct psychic attack from an organism specifically evolved to override human mental resistance. Marcus chose the direct approach, relying on the mental conditioning that all Catachan natives developed through childhood exposure to the jungle's psychic hazards. He advanced into the colony's influence zone while maintaining a meditative state that compartmentalized his consciousness, protecting his core decision-making processes behind layers of disciplined thought. The Brainleaf assault began immediately. False sensory inputs flooded his awareness. The sound of his mother calling for help, the sight of safe shelter just ahead, the smell of cooking food that suggested friendly human presence. Each hallucination was designed to trigger instinctive responses that would lead him away from safe travel routes toward the colony's feeding mechanisms. Marcus ignored the false inputs and focused on physical navigation cues: compass heading, terrain features, the position of Catachan 7's diseased sun filtering through the jungle canopy. He moved with mechanical precision, each step calculated to maintain forward progress without deviating from his planned route. The psychic pressure intensified as he penetrated deeper into the colony's territory. Now he was experiencing false memories of conversations that had never happened, emotional responses to stimuli that didn't exist, phantom pain from injuries he had not sustained. The Brainleaf colony was attempting to completely override his sensory input systems, replacing reality with a fabricated environment that would guide him into its trap. But Catachan natives learned to resist psychic manipulation before they learned to walk. Marcus's mind had been hardened by years of exposure to similar attacks from lesser organisms, conditioned to maintain function even when his senses could not be trusted. He continued forward movement while his consciousness retreated behind defensive barriers that had been built through decades of survival training. The crossing took 47 minutes of subjective time, though his chronometer indicated that only 12 minutes had elapsed in the outside world. Time distortion was another weapon in the Brainleaf arsenal, designed to confuse prey animals about the duration of their exposure to psychic influence. By the time Marcus emerged from the colony's area of effect, his mental defenses were strained to their limits, and his nervous system was flooded with stress hormones that would require hours to metabolize. But he was alive, uninjured, and still on course for Firebase Alpha 7. The second major obstacle was the man-eater shark feeding ground, a section of jungle where the apex predators had established permanent territorial claims. Unlike Brainleaf colonies, which attacked through indirect manipulation, man-eater sharks were direct physical threats that relied on speed, strength, and tactical intelligence to eliminate their prey. Marcus approached the feeding ground using extreme stealth protocols, moving at a pace that prioritized concealment over speed. Man-eater sharks hunted through a combination of visual tracking, scent analysis, and vibration sensing, requiring him to minimize his signature across all detectable spectrums. His movement became a careful dance of placement and timing, each step coordinated with natural sounds that would mask his presence. The feeding ground itself was marked by the scattered remains of previous kills: bleached bones that had been cracked open for marrow, metal fragments from equipment that had been tested and found inedible, patches of vegetation that had been killed by the acidic digestive secretions that man-eater sharks use to pre-process their meals. The entire area carried the distinctive chemical signature of apex predator territory, a scent that triggered instinctive fear responses in most life forms. Marcus spent 2 hours navigating around the feeding ground's perimeter, using natural terrain features to mask his passage while maintaining visual surveillance of the area for signs of shark movement. His route took him through swampy terrain where each footstep risked triggering underwater vibrations that could attract attention, but the alternative was crossing open ground where his movement would be visible to any predator scanning the area. Halfway around the feeding ground, he encountered evidence of recent predator activity. A kill site less than 6 hours old where something large had been taken down and partially consumed. The blood was still fresh, the scent trails still active, the ground still saturated with pheromones that would attract scavengers from across the sector. Which meant at least one man-eater shark was in the immediate area, probably resting after feeding but potentially active if it detected new prey opportunities. Marcus froze his movement and activated the full spectrum of Catachan survival techniques. His breathing became shallow and controlled, minimizing carbon dioxide output that might be detected by chemical sensors. His heart rate decreased through conscious regulation, reducing the bioelectric emissions that some predators could track. His mind entered a meditative state that suppressed the brainwave patterns associated with fear and aggression. For 23 minutes, he remained perfectly motionless while scanning his environment for signs of shark presence. The predators were masters of camouflage, capable of remaining undetected even when observed directly, but they could not completely eliminate all traces of their existence. Small environmental anomalies, disturbed vegetation patterns, unusual shadow configurations, subtle changes in local insect behavior provided clues to their location and activity status. Marcus identified 3 potential shark positions within his immediate area. A depression 30 meters to his northeast that might conceal a resting predator, a fallen log 40 meters to his southwest that provided ideal ambush cover, and a section of dense undergrowth 50 meters directly ahead that offered concealment for multiple organisms. Any of these locations could contain death. All of them had to be avoided or neutralized before he could continue his journey. The solution required patience and tactical thinking. Marcus began a careful withdrawal from his current position, retracing his steps with even greater stealth than he had used during his approach. His movement was measured in centimeters per minute, each adjustment of position calculated to avoid triggering the motion detection systems that man-eater sharks use to identify prey. The withdrawal took an hour and led him back to a position where he could observe the suspected shark hiding places from a safe distance. Here, he settled into a concealed observation post and began the process of confirming or eliminating each potential threat through systematic surveillance. The fallen log revealed itself first. A section of bark shifted slightly, exposing the distinctive pattern of scales that covered a man-eater shark's hide. The predator was approximately 6 meters in length, positioned for ambush along the most direct route through its territory. It had been waiting in position for several hours, demonstrating the patience that made these creatures such effective hunters. Marcus marked the shark's position and began searching for movement patterns that would allow him to bypass its ambush zone. Man-eater sharks were intelligent enough to predict prey behavior and position themselves accordingly, but they were also territorial creatures with established patrol routes and feeding schedules. Patient observation could identify windows of opportunity when the predator was focused on other activities. The opportunity came when a pack of smaller scavengers approached the recent kill site. The man-eater shark's attention shifted to these new arrivals, its body language changing from passive ambush readiness to active threat assessment. For approximately 10 minutes, the predator would be focused on determining whether the scavengers represented competition for its kill or additional prey opportunities. Marcus used this distraction to complete his bypass of the feeding ground, moving through terrain that would normally be too exposed for safe passage. His route took him across open ground where he would be visible to any predator that happened to look in his direction, but the risk was acceptable given the limited duration of his exposure and the predator's distracted state. By the time the man-eater shark returned its attention to ambush readiness, Marcus had cleared its territory and was approaching the final major obstacle of his journey, the Whispering Hills. The Whispering Hills were named for the acoustic phenomena that occurred when wind patterns interacted with the unique geological formations found in this region. But the whispers that gave the area its name were not created by natural air currents. They were produced by predatory organisms that used sonic manipulation to lure prey into killing range. These creatures, known locally as sound hunters, represented one of the most sophisticated threats on Catachan 7th. They possessed the ability to analyze and reproduce human speech patterns, creating false audio signatures that could mimic specific individuals with uncanny accuracy. Their hunting strategy involved impersonating trusted voices, family members, military commanders, religious figures, to convince prey that safe shelter or friendly assistance was available just ahead. The effect was psychologically devastating. particularly for humans who had been traveling alone through hostile territory for extended periods. After hours of isolation and constant threat awareness, the sound of a familiar voice offering safety and companionship was almost impossible to resist. Marcus approached the Whispering Hills with his audio sensors set to minimum sensitivity and his mental defenses raised to maximum alertness. He knew that the Sound Hunters would begin their assault the moment he entered their territory, and that his survival depended on his ability to distinguish between genuine environmental sounds and artificially generated lures. The first whisper reached him as he crested the ridge that marked the boundary of Sound Hunter territory. It was his father's voice, calling his name with the exact intonation that Bram used when summoning his son for important conversations. The sound seemed to come from a position just ahead and to the left, where a natural depression in the terrain would provide concealment from aerial predators. Marcus ignored the false audio and continued on his planned route, but the Sound Hunters were just beginning their assault. Over the next hour, he was subjected to a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological manipulation. He heard his mother weeping and calling for help, suggesting that she had become lost in the jungle while searching for him. He heard the voices of his childhood friends reporting that New Esperanza was under attack and needed his immediate assistance. He heard Imperial Guard officers ordering him to report to specific locations for emergency briefings. Each false voice was perfectly rendered, complete with the speech patterns, emotional inflections, and personal knowledge that would be possessed by the real individuals. The Sound Hunters had somehow acquired detailed information about his personal relationships and psychological vulnerabilities, using this intelligence to craft lures that targeted his specific emotional weak points. But Marcus had been preparing for this test his entire life. Catachan's survival training included extensive conditioning to resist sonic manipulation, using techniques developed over generations of conflict with Sound Hunters and similar organisms. He maintained forward movement while his conscious mind cataloged and dismissed each false audio input, treating them as data to be processed rather than emotional triggers requiring response. The key to resistance was understanding that the Sound Hunters' most powerful weapon was not their ability to reproduce familiar voices, but their capacity to exploit human social instincts that prioritized group survival over individual preservation. The false voices were designed to activate rescue responses, family loyalty, and military obedience, all psychological drives that normally served to strengthen human communities but became deadly vulnerabilities when exploited by predators. Marcus countered these attacks by maintaining emotional isolation, treating his journey through Sound Hunter territory as a purely mechanical navigation exercise. He calculated distance and bearing to his destination, monitored his physical condition and resource expenditure, and executed predetermined movement patterns without allowing conscious thought to focus on the false audio inputs that surrounded him. The strategy succeeded, but at a significant psychological cost. By the time he cleared Sound Hunter territory, Marcus had been subjected to 4 hours of systematic emotional manipulation designed to exploit every personal relationship and psychological vulnerability he possessed. His stress levels were elevated beyond normal human tolerances. His decision-making processes were compromised by mental fatigue, and his emotional stability had been stretched to its breaking point. But he was still alive, still on course, and within sight of Firebase Alpha 7. The Imperial Guard garrison that occupied Firebase Alpha 7 consisted of approximately 200 personnel drawn from various Catachan regiments. Their mission was to maintain Imperial authority in the sector, provide support to civilian settlements, and serve as a communications relay for military operations throughout the region. The base itself was a fortress designed to withstand everything Catachan 7 could deploy against it: automated defense systems, hardened bunkers, and enough firepower to eliminate most threats that the jungle might produce. Marcus approached the firebase using standard Imperial identification protocols, broadcasting his identity and mission status on military communication frequencies. The response was immediate and professional. Automated weapon systems tracked his approach while human sentries verified his credentials and authorization codes. Guardsman Marcus Thorne, reporting from New Esperanza settlement, he announced as he reached the main gate. I carry priority intelligence regarding organized criminal activity in this sector. The gate guards were experienced Catachan veterans whose scarred faces and mechanical augmentations told stories of decades spent fighting for survival in the galaxy's most hostile environments. They processed his credentials with the efficiency of soldiers who understood that every minute of delay could mean death for Imperial citizens throughout the region. Within 10 minutes, Marcus found himself in the Firebase's command bunker, briefing Colonel Maximilian Kane on the raider attack and its implications for sector security. The colonel was a career Imperial Guard officer whose 40 years of service had taken him through some of the most brutal campaigns in Imperial history. His interest in Marcus's report was both professional and personal. Raiders operating in his sector were a direct challenge to Imperial authority that demanded immediate response. Penal Legion deserters, Kane mused after reviewing the evidence Marcus had carried from New Esperanza. That explains their tactical competence and complete disregard for casualties. These are men who were sent to Catachan to die, survived their sentences, and decided to remain here rather than face whatever justice awaited them in the larger Imperium. The colonel's analysis matched Marcus's own conclusions but raised additional questions about the scope of the criminal organization. If deserters from multiple Penal Legion units were coordinating their activities, the threat they represented went far beyond simple banditry. They possessed military training, combat experience, and knowledge of Imperial tactics that would make them formidable opponents for the scattered civilian settlements that dotted Catachan 7's hostile landscape. How many settlements have reported similar attacks? Marcus asked. 7 confirmed incidents in the past 6 months, Kane replied grimly. 3 settlements completely destroyed, 4 others successfully defended but with heavy casualties. The pattern suggests a systematic campaign rather than random opportunistic raids. The numbers were sobering. 7 attacks meant hundreds of Imperial citizens killed, wounded, or displaced by criminal activity that could have been prevented with better intelligence and coordination. But Catachan 7's hostile environment made such coordination extremely difficult. Communication between settlements was limited, transportation was dangerous, and the constant threat of jungle predators left little resources available for anti-criminal operations. What's the plan? Marcus asked. Colonel Kane studied the tactical displays that showed known and suspected criminal activity throughout the sector. His expression was grim but determined, reflecting years of experience with situations where Imperial authority was challenged by organized opposition. We're going to hunt them down, he said simply. Every deserter, every raider, every criminal who thinks they can prey on loyal Imperial citizens in my sector. We're going to find them, fix them, and finish them with extreme prejudice. The operation that followed became known as Punishment Detail, a month-long campaign that swept through the deep jungle hunting for concentrations of criminal activity. Marcus found himself assigned to Scout Team Alpha, one of 6 units tasked with locating raider camps and gathering intelligence for the main assault forces. His team consisted of 8 Catachan veterans, each one a specialist in a different aspect of jungle warfare. Their mission was to penetrate hostile territory, identify enemy positions, and provide targeting data for the Firebase's heavy weapons. It was dangerous work that required moving through some of the most hostile terrain on Catachan 7, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge that separated true Catachan devils from ordinary soldiers. The first raider camp they located was hidden in a natural cave complex approximately 40 kilometers southeast of Firebase Alpha 7. The site showed evidence of long-term occupation, improved defensive positions, sophisticated communication equipment, and supply caches that could sustain a significant force for extended periods. The raiders had obviously been planning their campaign for months, possibly years, building the infrastructure necessary for sustained operations against Imperial settlements. Scout Team Alpha spent 3 days conducting detailed surveillance of the camp, cataloging personnel strength, equipment capabilities, and defensive measures. The intelligence they gathered revealed an organization far more sophisticated than anyone had suspected. The raiders possessed military-grade weapons, professional communications equipment, and tactical discipline that matched regular Imperial Guard units. Most disturbing was the discovery that the raiders were actively recruiting new members from the civilian population. Several individuals who had been reported missing from various settlements were identified among the raider personnel, apparently serving as willing collaborators rather than coerced captives. The criminal organization was not simply preying on Catachan's population. It was converting citizens into active participants in anti-imperial activity. The assault on the first raider camp was conducted by 2 companies of Imperial Guard infantry supported by heavy weapons teams and aerial reconnaissance. The attack began at dawn with precision airstrikes that eliminated the raiders' defensive positions, followed by ground assault that swept through the cave complex with overwhelming force. The battle lasted 6 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of the raider organization's primary base. 43 criminals were killed in action, 17 were captured for interrogation, and massive quantities of stolen equipment were recovered for return to their rightful owners. The operation was considered a complete success by military standards. But for Marcus, the victory felt hollow. Many of the dead raiders were Imperial citizens who had chosen crime over loyalty, corruption over duty. They were people who had faced the same challenges that every Catachan native encountered: the daily struggle for survival in an environment that offered no mercy to the weak or unprepared, but had responded to those challenges by preying on their own species rather than standing united against the threats that surrounded them. The campaign continued for 3 more weeks, targeting 6 additional raider camps and eliminating organized criminal activity throughout the sector. Each operation followed the same pattern: careful reconnaissance, precise intelligence gathering, overwhelming assault force, and complete destruction of enemy capabilities. By the end of the month, Colonel Kane's forces had killed or captured over 200 criminals and restored Imperial authority to areas that had been effectively lawless for years. Marcus participated in 4 separate assault operations, serving as a scout, forward observer, and assault trooper depending on mission requirements. His performance earned commendations from his commanding officers and the respect of his fellow soldiers. More importantly, it provided him with the combat experience that would be essential for survival during his upcoming trials. But the campaign also taught him darker lessons about human nature and the price of survival on a death world. He had seen Imperial citizens choose betrayal over loyalty, had watched desperate people justify collaboration with criminals, had witnessed the breakdown of social bonds under the pressure of constant threat and limited resources. These were lessons that would serve him well when he finally undertook the ritual that would mark his transition from childhood to adulthood on Catachan 7th. The trials began 3 months later, on the anniversary of Marcus's 24th standard year of life. The ritual was as old as human settlement on Catachan 7th, a coming-of-age ceremony that tested whether young adults possessed the physical capability, mental discipline, and moral strength necessary to call themselves true Catachan devils. The requirements were simple in concept but lethal in execution. Each candidate was required to venture into the deep jungle alone, locate a living barking toad, and retrieve one of the creature's distinctive fangs without using any weapons more sophisticated than a combat knife. The fang had to be taken from a living animal. Corpses and shed teeth were not acceptable proof of success. The entire operation had to be completed within 7 standard days, after which the candidate was expected to return to their home settlement for verification of their achievement. Failure meant death. Success meant recognition as a full adult member of Catachan society with all the rights and responsibilities that status entailed. Marcus began his trial at dawn on the appointed day, carrying the same minimal equipment that had served him during his journey to Firebase Alpha 7. His route led into the deep jungle far from any human settlement, into territory where the predators were larger, hungrier, and more sophisticated than anything found near civilized areas. This was Catachan 7th at its most lethal, an environment where the planet's evolutionary processes had produced organisms specifically adapted for killing anything that moved. Here, the trees themselves were predators, their root systems capable of detecting the approach of prey animals from kilometers away. The very air was toxic, saturated with spores and chemical agents that could kill unprotected humans within minutes of exposure. It was also the only place where barking toads could be found in their natural habitat. Barking toads were amphibious predators that combined the worst characteristics of Catachan's terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. They possessed the size and strength of major land predators, the chemical arsenal of toxic aquatic species, and the intelligence of organisms that had evolved in direct competition with human settlements. An adult barking toad stood 2 meters at the shoulder, weighed as much as a small vehicle, and possessed reflexes that could intercept projectile weapons fire. Their distinctive fangs were prized not for their material properties — the tooth itself was ordinary bone matter — but for what they represented. Successfully taking a fang from a living barking toad required tracking skills that could locate a master predator in its natural habitat, stealth capabilities that could approach such a creature without being detected, combat prowess that could survive direct confrontation with one of Catachan's apex predators, and tactical intelligence that could accomplish all of this using nothing but primitive weapons and personal skill. It was a test that eliminated approximately 70% of those who attempted it. Marcus's first challenge was simply locating a suitable barking toad. The creatures were territorial with individual hunting ranges that could cover hundreds of square kilometers. They were also nomadic, moving through their territories according to seasonal patterns that tracked prey animal migrations and environmental changes. Finding one required understanding Catachan's ecosystem at a level that went far beyond simple survival knowledge. He began by analyzing environmental clues that might indicate recent toad activity, unusual patterns of prey animal behavior, chemical traces in water sources, distinctive markings on vegetation that showed where large predators had passed. The search process required perfect attention to detail, as the difference between a barking toad trace and the sign left by other large predators was often measured in millimeters of claw mark depth or parts per million of chemical concentration. The search took 4 days, during which Marcus traveled deeper into hostile territory than he had ever ventured before. He crossed swamplands where the water itself was acidic enough to dissolve metal, navigated through forest sections where the trees attacked anything that moved, and survived encounters with predators that existed nowhere else in the known galaxy. Each day brought new challenges that tested different aspects of his survival training. He was stalked by pack hunters that coordinated their attacks through pheromone communication. He was attacked by plants that could think, plan, and execute tactical maneuvers. He encountered weather patterns that had been weaponized by the planet's ecosystem, turning natural phenomena like rain and wind into deadly hazards that could kill the unprepared. But gradually, patiently, he assembled a picture of barking toad activity in the region. The signs were subtle. A feeding site here, a territorial marking there, traces of chemical secretions that indicated recent passage. But they formed a pattern that suggested the presence of a large adult somewhere in the northwestern section of his search area. The trail led to a series of connected waterholes that provided habitat for the amphibious predator during its terrestrial hunting phase. Here, Marcus found definitive proof of barking toad presence. Fresh tracks in the soft earth around the water, chemical signatures that could only come from the creature's distinctive glandular secretions, and feeding remains that showed the systematic precision that marked apex predator kills. The toad was here, somewhere in the immediate area, probably resting during the heat of midday before beginning its evening hunt. Marcus settled into a concealed observation position and began the patient process of locating his target. Barking toads were masters of camouflage, capable of remaining undetected even when observed directly from close range. Their hide could shift color and texture to match their surroundings. Their body heat could be regulated to avoid thermal detection, and their breathing could be controlled to eliminate the regular patterns that most surveillance techniques relied upon. Finding the creature required using every sense he possessed, along with intuitive awareness that came from years of experience with Catachan's predatory ecosystem. He searched for visual anomalies that might reveal camouflaged hide, listened for subtle sounds that might indicate controlled breathing, tested the air for chemical traces that might indicate recent predator activity. The search lasted 7 hours, during which Marcus remained motionless in his hiding place while systematically examining every square meter of visible terrain. The level of concentration required was exhausting, demanding perfect alertness while suppressing all natural human movement patterns that might alert the predator to his presence. Finally, his persistence was rewarded. A section of mud and vegetation 30 meters to his left shifted slightly, revealing the distinctive eye ridge that marked a barking toad's camouflaged position. The creature was enormous, easily the largest specimen he had ever seen, with fangs that protruded several centimeters beyond its closed jawline. It was perfect, exactly the kind of trophy that would prove his worthiness to join the ranks of true Catachan devils. Now came the hardest part, getting close enough to extract a fang without being killed in the process. Barking toads possessed multiple defensive capabilities that made direct assault suicidal. Their hide was thick enough to stop small arms fire, their reflexes were fast enough to intercept projectile weapons, and their chemical arsenal included paralytic toxins that could incapacitate prey animals through skin contact. Most dangerously, they were intelligent enough to learn from experience, adapting their tactics based on the behavior of previous attackers. Marcus's approach had to be perfect on the first attempt. There would be no opportunity for trial and error, no chance to retreat and try again with improved tactics. Either he would succeed in his first assault, or he would join the 70% of candidates who never returned from their trials. He spent 2 hours planning his attack, analyzing the terrain around the toad's position, identifying potential approach routes, and calculating the precise sequence of movements that would give him the best chance of success. The plan he developed was insanely risky, depending on split-second timing and perfect execution of techniques he had practiced but never tested under actual combat conditions. The attack began with a careful approach that took advantage of natural terrain features to mask his movement. Marcus crawled through swamp water that was acidic enough to burn exposed skin, using the chemical soup to mask his scent signature while accepting the physical damage that prolonged exposure would cause. The approach took 40 minutes and brought him to within striking distance of the resting predator. The barking toad remained motionless, its camouflage so perfect that Marcus could barely distinguish its outline even from close range. But he could see the subtle movements that indicated controlled breathing, the minute adjustments that showed the creature was aware of his presence and preparing for violent action. The moment of attack arrived without warning. 1 second the jungle was still and quiet. The next it erupted into desperate violence as man and predator engaged in mortal combat. The barking toad's response was faster than human reflexes, its massive body launching toward Marcus with speed that should have been impossible for something so large. Marcus had anticipated this response and was already moving when the attack began. His combat knife was in his hand, its edge honed to molecular sharpness, its balance familiar from thousands of hours of practice. His body moved through trained sequences that bypassed conscious thought, executing techniques that had been drilled into muscle memory through years of preparation. The first exchange lasted 3 seconds and determined the outcome of the entire encounter. Marcus's knife found the gap between the toad's armor plates, its point penetrating deep enough to cause serious injury without striking vital organs. The predator's counterattack missed by millimeters, its claws passing through space that Marcus had occupied an instant earlier. But the wound had been inflicted, and now the creature was bleeding, angry, and focused entirely on eliminating the threat that had dared to attack it in its own territory. The battle that followed tested every skill Marcus had developed during his years on Catachan 7th. The barking toad fought with the desperate fury of a cornered predator, using its size, speed, and natural weapons in combinations that would have overwhelmed any opponent who lacked perfect training and absolute commitment. Its attacks were relentless, its tactics sophisticated, its determination absolute. Marcus matched the creature's fury with trained precision, using his smaller size and greater mobility to avoid direct confrontation while landing precise strikes that accumulated damage over time. His knife work was surgical, targeting specific points where the creature's natural armor was weakest, exploiting anatomical knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Catachan survivors. The battle lasted 17 minutes, though Marcus's subjective experience suggested hours of combat. When it was over, the barking toad lay still beside one of the water holes that had been its territory, its lifeblood mixing with the acidic water that had sustained it through years of predatory dominance. Marcus knelt beside the fallen creature and carefully extracted one of its fangs, using his combat knife to cut through the connective tissue that held the tooth in place. The fang was 12 centimeters long, perfectly formed and still warm with the heat of life. It was proof of his success, evidence that he had passed the trial that separated children from adults on the most dangerous world in the Imperium. But the trial was not over. He still had to return to New Esperanza within the prescribed time limit, carrying his trophy through hostile territory, while dealing with injuries sustained during the fight. His left shoulder bore claw marks that would require medical attention. His right arm showed chemical burns from exposure to the creature's toxic secretions, and his entire body was exhausted from the physical demands of combat against an apex predator. The journey home took 2 days of careful travel through terrain that seemed even more hostile than before. Marcus's injuries made movement painful and slow, while the scent of barking toad blood that clung to his clothing attracted scavengers from across the region. He was forced to fight off 3 separate attacks from pack predators that saw him as wounded prey. Easy pickings for creatures that normally wouldn't risk confrontation with armed humans. Each encounter tested his remaining strength and determination. Each successful defense brought him closer to the limits of human endurance. By the time he finally saw the defensive barriers of New Esperanza rising above the jungle canopy, Marcus was operating on willpower alone, his body pushed beyond normal human tolerances by the demands of the trial. But he had succeeded. He had faced Catachan 7's deadliest predator in single combat and emerged victorious. He had proven himself worthy of the name Catachan Devil, earning the right to stand among the most feared warriors in the Imperial Guard. The celebration of his success was brief but meaningful. The entire settlement gathered to witness the formal presentation of his trophy, the ritual scarification that would mark him as a proven adult, and the ceremony that would officially recognize his new status within Catachan society. His family's pride was evident in their faces, their joy tempered by the knowledge of how many young people never returned from the trials. But Marcus's personal satisfaction was complicated by the understanding of what his success really meant. He was now old enough for military recruitment, eligible for service in the Imperial Guard regiments that recruited their personnel exclusively from Catachan 7's survivors. Within months, he would probably receive orders to report for duty, beginning a career that would take him away from his homeworld to fight in conflicts across the galaxy. This was the ultimate purpose of Catachan 7's harsh environment and brutal traditions. The Death World existed not to support human civilization in any conventional sense, but to produce soldiers whose capabilities exceeded those of normal human beings. Every trial, every survival challenge, every encounter with lethal predators was part of a selection process that eliminated the weak and trained the strong for service to the Imperium. Marcus had survived childhood on a world that killed 90% of its inhabitants before their 15th birthday. He had passed trials that eliminated 70% of those who attempted them. He had proven himself capable of functioning in environments that would be instantly lethal to most Imperial citizens. These achievements marked him as a valuable resource in the Imperium's endless wars. A soldier whose training and experience could not be replicated through conventional military programs. But they also marked him as expendable, a product of a system that measured human worth in terms of combat effectiveness and strategic utility. His survival on Catachan 7 had been remarkable by any objective standard, but from the Imperium's perspective, it was simply proof that he was suitable raw material for transformation into something even more dangerous. The recruitment summons arrived 6 weeks later, delivered by an Imperial Guard courier who had traveled from the sector capital to formally notify Marcus of his selection for military service. The orders were simple and absolute. Report to Firebase Alpha 7 within 10 standard days for transportation to the Catachan Regiment training facilities on Catachan III. No exceptions would be considered. No appeals would be heard. No alternatives would be offered. Marcus packed his personal belongings with the same methodical efficiency he had learned during his years of survival training. Everything he owned fit into a single combat pack. His father's ceremonial knife, his mother's blessing beads, a few pieces of clothing suitable for military service, and the barking toad fang that proved his completion of the trials. Everything else, his childhood memories, his family relationships, his connection to the world that had shaped him, would remain behind on Catachan 7, preserved in the hearts and minds of those who might never see him again. His departure from New Esperanza was marked by the same practical stoicism that governed all aspects of Catachan life. His parents offered their blessing and their pride, but no tears or expressions of grief that might suggest weakness in the face of imperial duty. His friends and neighbors acknowledged his achievement and wished him success in his future service. But no one pretended that military service was anything other than another form of survival trial with different stakes and different consequences. The transport that carried Marcus away from Catachan 7 was filled with other young adults who had successfully completed their trials and been selected for Imperial service. They came from settlements across the planet's hostile surface, each one a survivor of challenges that would have killed ordinary human beings, each one a product of the same brutal selection process that had shaped Marcus's entire life. As their ship broke orbit and headed for the training worlds where they would be transformed into Imperial Guard soldiers, Marcus looked back at Catachan 7 through a viewport that showed the planet's diseased continents and poisoned oceans. From space, it looked almost peaceful, a green and blue world that might have supported normal human civilization under different circumstances. But Marcus knew the truth that distance concealed. Every square kilometer of that planetary surface was a killing ground, where death came in countless forms and survival was measured in minutes rather than years. Every breath of air carried toxins that would kill unprotected humans. Every plant, animal, and microorganism had evolved to kill anything that moved. It was a world that existed solely to produce soldiers for the Imperium's endless wars. A factory that consumed human lives to create weapons in human form. Marcus was one of those weapons now, shaped by 2 decades of survival on humanity's most hostile world, hardened by challenges that exceeded normal human limitations, prepared for service in conflicts where ordinary soldiers would fail. But he was also something more. He was a son of Catachan 7, a survivor who had proven himself against odds that defied calculation. A human being who had maintained his essential humanity despite being raised in an environment that treated human life as nothing more than raw material for military production, as the transport carried him toward whatever destiny awaited him among the stars. Marcus carried with him the knowledge that survival was possible even in the most impossible circumstances. That human courage could triumph over inhuman challenges. That the individual spirit could endure even when faced with forces designed to crush it. This was the true legacy of Catachan 7, not just the creation of superior soldiers, but the proof that human beings could adapt to anything the galaxy might present, could survive in environments that should have been instantly lethal, could find ways to maintain dignity and purpose even when reduced to the most basic struggle for continued existence. The death world had made him into a weapon, but it had also made him into something that no amount of training could create. A human being who understood the true value of life because he had fought for every day of his existence, who appreciated the worth of civilization because he had seen what happened when it was stripped away, who recognized the importance of loyalty and courage because he had witnessed the consequences of their absence. These were the qualities that made Catachan Devils legendary throughout the Imperial Guard, feared by enemies and respected by allies across the galaxy. Not just their physical capabilities or combat skills, but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human in a universe that seemed designed to destroy humanity. Marcus settled back in his transport seat and began the mental process of preparing for the next phase of his life. The trials of Catachan 7 were behind him now, but greater challenges awaited him among the stars. Wars that would make his homeworld's dangers seem simple by comparison. Enemies that possessed capabilities beyond anything his survival training had prepared him for. Conflicts that would test not just his physical abilities but his moral strength and spiritual endurance. But he was ready for these challenges, prepared by a lifetime of surviving on a world that existed solely to kill him. He carried with him the strength of Catachan 7, the wisdom of its survivors, and the knowledge that no matter what the galaxy might present, human courage could find a way to endure. The transport accelerated toward its destination, carrying its cargo of newly forged weapons toward whatever wars awaited them in the darkness between the stars. Behind them, Catachan 7 continued its eternal rotation, its surface teeming with the deadly life forms that would shape another generation of survivors. Another cadre of soldiers for the Imperium's endless conflicts. The cycle would continue as it had for millennia, as it would for millennia to come. Death worlds would produce their deadly harvest. Young survivors would prove themselves worthy of the name Catachan Devil. The strongest would be selected for service to the Emperor, while the rest would remain behind to continue the process with the next generation. This was life on a death world in the Warhammer 40k universe. A constant struggle against impossible odds, where survival itself was an achievement that marked individuals as exceptional by galactic standards. Where the simple act of drawing breath required courage, skill, and determination that would be legendary anywhere else in human space. It was a life that most Imperial citizens could not imagine, would not choose, and could not survive. But for those who were born to it, who were shaped by its demands, who proved themselves worthy of its challenges, it was also something more. It was the crucible that forged the strongest steel, the testing ground that separated the exceptional from the ordinary, the foundation upon which legends were built. Marcus Thorne carried that foundation with him as he traveled toward his destiny among the stars. A son of Catachan VII who had earned the right to call himself a devil, prepared for whatever battles awaited him in the Emperor's name.